Hello and welcome. My name is Sarah Tatanchi, and I'm the Executive Director of the Southern Center for Human Rights. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to a workshop called Examining the Intersection Between Criminal Justice and Financial Services in the Deep South. This webinar, which is sponsored by the Hope Policy Institute, is a continuation of the efforts to explore the interlocking systems of imprisonment and economic inequality that block formerly incarcerated people from reaching sustained financial mobility levels and thus preventing successful reentry. We have a very exciting panel for you today. And to kick it off, we're so excited to present to you some new research from the Hope Policy Institute in the form of a study called Debt Burden for Formerly Incarcerated Tops $4 Billion. This will be presented to you by Calandra Davis, who is a policy analyst at the Hope Policy Institute. Prior to joining the policy team, Calandra served as Hope's financial inclusion officer for the Central Mississippi market, where she provided financial inclusion services to the unbanked and underbanked and built partnerships to address economic mobility, the racial wealth gap, and affordable housing. Calandra, thanks for presenting about your study to us. It's all yours.
Thank you, Sarah. So again, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Calandra Davis, a policy analyst with Hope Policy Institute, which is the policy arm of Hope Enterprise Corporation and Hope Credit Union. Hope Policy Institute's most recent report is examining the intersection of criminal justice and financial services in the Deep South is the foundation for today's discussion. This presentation is rooted not only in the data and analysis of federal criminal justice debt in the Deep South, but also in the experiences of those impacted by the criminal system. Next slide, please. There are various forms of financial barriers that people face once interacting with the criminal system, which are discussed fully in the paper. For the purposes of today's presentation, we will focus mostly on criminal justice-related debt, which is debt composed of legally binding financial obligations imposed on those convicted by criminal courts. We'll hear more later in the webinar from the Sycamore Institute about the impact of fines and fees in one Deep South state. On slide 3, we will talk about why it's so important to focus this conversation on the Deep South region. 4 of the 10 states with the highest incarceration rates in the country are concentrated in this region. We often think about the criminal justice and financial system as 2 separate systems. This map shows how these systems interlock. Debt is connected to both the high incarceration rates and the high and underbanked household rates. Unbanked households are defined as not having a savings or checking account with a financial institution. In one majority Black Alabama county, Jefferson County, the state prison incarceration rate surpasses the state's rate at 627 per 100,000 residents. The same county also holds a high rate of unbanked households at 20.6%. In comparison, the national rate of unbanked households is just 5.4%. Next slide, please. There is a long, costly history that binds criminal and economic injustices. The costs and impacts are highly concentrated in communities already stricken with persistent poverty. In 2019, people in the Deep South were burdened by more than $4 billion in debt related to their interaction with the federal criminal system, more than double than what it was 10 years ago. Formerly incarcerated individuals pay their debts to society twice. Once by serving out their sentences, and again by carrying the burden of heavy debts upon release. These debts are often used to reincarcerate people, prevent people from voting, and revoke state driver's licenses. And those of us in the South know that licenses are not just significant for opening accounts, but also for getting back and forth to work. But I will let Alabama Appleseed take a deeper dive into this later in the presentation. Next slide, please. There are severe concrete examples of the consequences of debt. The stories of those impacted by these consequences are highlighted throughout the report, and we will hear more later about shared experiences from Decarcerate. The debt issue exacerbates the challenges people are facing when re-entering society. Whether those debts are accumulated before or during incarceration, they follow individuals long after their release, and in many instances, bringing them right back into the criminal system. One example of debt accumulation while incarcerated can be seen by taking a closer look at multiple Alabama counties. Incarcerated folks are personally billed for their healthcare needs, and their bills can end up with collection agencies while they have no source of income, wreaking havoc on their credit. And family members often take up the burden of paying the debt to ensure the healthcare needs of their loved ones continue. For Mississippians, the inability to pay the debts associated with criminal justice monetary sanctions often leads to reincarceration. In fact, there are 4 restitution centers across the state serving as debtors' prisons, where formerly incarcerated individuals work to earn money to pay off court-ordered debts. Though half of the people housed at the centers owe less than $3,500 in debt, they stay 4 months on average, and sometimes years working to satisfy debts. Next slide, please. This slide articulates the massive amount of debt hanging over the Deep South. Take a moment to imagine what else might be possible. If people were paying this money towards a down payment for a home for their family, or small business startups, or even transportation to get to and from work, rather than giving this money to these extractive debt mechanisms. People impacted by the criminal system are losing out on so much more because of the barriers to access wealth building opportunities. Debt is just one small piece of the puzzle, yet we can't solve the puzzle without tackling the issue of debt first. Next slide, please. Now that we've talked about the many barriers people face, let's talk about solutions. Policymakers must consider economic equality in their decision-making to ensure the criminal justice system is less punitive and more equitable. Policies that champion debt reduction are particularly important for formerly incarcerated persons who are more likely to encounter predatory lending practices and lack access to credit. Policymakers should ease debt collection practices and prevent the accumulation of debt during incarceration. Local, state, and federal governments should set caps on criminal justice debt to waive fees and fines of low-income individuals involved in the justice system. And lastly, policymakers should prohibit the revocation of driver's licenses for unpaid fines and fees. Next slide, please. So I want to again say thank you to everyone who's listening in on today, and to my colleagues at Hope and those with lived experiences to help influence this work. I will now pass it back to Sarah to take us into the next part of this presentation.
Thank you so much, Calandra, for that incredibly helpful and informative study and observations. We appreciate you and the work that you do very, very much. And as you teed up, we're about to hear from Brian Straisley, the Director of External Affairs for the Sycamore Institute, to take a deep dive on a particular state, Tennessee. Brian has been with the Sycamore Institute since 2017 and shapes messaging and public relation efforts for the Institute, working with journalists and the public to make sure that they get these issues right. Brian, we're thrilled to have you here today. I'm going to hand it off to you to tell us more about the sheer scope of financial obligations that people can face in Tennessee.
Great. Yeah, thank you for having me. So the Sycamore Institute is a nonpartisan public policy research center for Tennessee, and we take a policy-neutral approach to research and analyze state-level issues that affect and connect Tennesseans' health and prosperity. Sycamore doesn't lobby or advocate. Instead, we help folks understand complicated issues and recognize that people may have different perspectives on the same set of facts. So in 2020, we started looking at Tennessee's criminal fees and fines. And there's been a growing consensus and interest from the left and right in our state to look at this issue. But what's missing is a clear consensus on where to start. Many have a fairly good grasp of some of the unintended consequences, but if you want to do something about it, what would make the biggest impact? How would changes affect the systems and services funded by this money? So Sycamore set out to paint a comprehensive picture of what these legal financial obligations are, why they exist and what purpose they serve, who decides them, how they affect people who owe them and the governments that collect them, and finally, the trade-offs and unintended consequences. It quickly became clear to us that this is complicated stuff. The story of fees and fines and their unintended consequences is very much one of death by 1,000 cuts. Still, I'm not sure that we fully appreciated how hard it would be to untangle this knot. For example, how much might someone pay for a specific offense? Well, it's complicated. How does the money that's collected get used? It's complicated. And should policymakers consider a complete overhaul of this system? Again, it's kind of complicated. So let's now take a look at a few visuals to illustrate what I mean. Can we go ahead and go to the next slide? Thank you. First, the sheer number of financial obligations. We found over 360 different ones spread across 17 of the 71 titles in Tennessee's state code. Here you see examples of what people might face throughout their interaction with the criminal justice system. Dozens, big and small, at every step, from arrest and pretrial to trial, conviction and incarceration, and even community supervision. Next slide. Second, state law authorizes or requires every one of those obligations, but many local actors determine what costs people ultimately incur. Most of these actors are popularly elected in each of Tennessee's 95 counties. Prosecutors, judges, juries, sheriffs, and then other law enforcement, local legislative bodies, and court clerks. Next slide. All right, so how does this money flow? To the left, you see various costs that people can owe. And in the middle, we see who collects it: state agencies, local officials, and even private entities in some cases. And in some situations, whoever collects it then passes it along to other parts of state or local government. And then finally, the dollars get distributed to victims, to state and local government general funds, to various parts of the criminal justice system, and then other programs as well. Next slide. To get a bit more specific, here are 10 of Tennessee's required criminal litigation taxes. On the left, you see each tax has a particular amount and the outcome that triggers it. County court clerks in the middle collect these taxes, and they get to keep a portion of the money for the county. That's the dark red or brown line. Those commission rates vary by tax. And then the clerks send the rest of the money that they aren't keeping to the state, which divvies it up in 16 different ways. Next slide. All right, so finally, when folks make payments toward their obligations, sometimes the costs balloon based on when and how they pay. State law prioritizes how payments apply to various obligations. So first are court fees and taxes, and then other fees and costs, then fines, and then finally victim restitution. If the person uses a payment plan, 5% of what they pay can be applied toward a payment plan fee. If they're paying 6 months past their due date, as much as half of what they pay goes towards a collector's fee, meaning that it could take twice as long for them to pay off their debt. So these are just a few of the complexities we've uncovered so far. And soon we'll start digging into more specific issues. And I'll leave you with one takeaway. What I've just showed you grew out of decades of piecemeal decisions that somebody always thought was a good idea at the time. But the end result is a tangled web of effects, incentives, and unintended consequences that I doubt lawmakers really meant to create. In doing this work, Sycamore aims to help policymakers understand this system and how it came about, which will make it easier for them to take steps toward addressing any problems they might see. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thanks to you and the Sycamore Institute for all your work illuminating the extraordinary amount of obligations that people face. Every time I see the chart of possible fines and fees, I am absolutely blown away by the scope and the creativity behind the people who put them into place. So thank you for that. And now we will move on to our third and final panelist of the day, Akeisha Anderson. Akeisha will be talking with us about the issue of driver's licenses and revocation relating to people who have been formerly incarcerated and their criminal justice debt. Akeisha is the legislative and policy attorney at the Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. She works as the policy director there, focusing on policy development, legislative advocacy, coalition building, and engaging with public officials. We are so grateful for her work and excited to hear from her today about these incredibly important issues. Akeisha, it's all yours.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that introduction, Sarah. As you all know, my name is Akeisha Anderson, and as was just stated, I serve as the policy director for Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. So just a bit of background about Alabama Appleseed. We are a small nonprofit, and we work to uproot systems that keep people trapped at the intersection of poverty and the criminal justice system. And we do this in several ways. We do this by conducting original research, publishing reports, and taking our findings to the State House to try to advance positive policy change and persuade legislators to take on our policy recommendations. This legislative session, 2 areas that I have worked on, or bills that I have worked to try to get passed, deal with suspension of driver's licenses unrelated to things, or for things unrelated to road safety, and the creation of a diversion program study commission. Next slide, please. In Alabama, we suspend driver's licenses for a host of things unrelated to unsafe driving. Things like failure to pay a ticket, failure to appear in court, and petty drug offenses. As is the case in many southern and rural areas, public transportation is virtually non-existent in Alabama. So if people need to get to work, to reentry programs, to pick their kid up from school, to get to the doctor's office, to address social service or to access social services outside the home, or even to escape an abusive home, they need a valid driver's license. And now more than ever, as Alabama experiences a workforce shortage and the economic devastation created by COVID-19, we are finding that it's imperative that potential workers have driver's licenses. Unfortunately, there are currently over 100,000 Alabamians with a suspended license for things unrelated to road safety. And Black Alabamians are disproportionately impacted by this practice due to disparities in community policing and the existence of the racial wealth gap. In 2018, Alabama Appleseed created a report entitled Stalled, and this report explored the practice of driver's license suspensions in Alabama. That year, we interviewed hundreds of Alabamians with licenses that were suspended due to unpaid traffic debt. When speaking to those people, we found that the median amount owed was $869, that 64% of respondents had been jailed due to unpaid traffic debt, 48% of respondents took out a high-interest payday loan to pay off their tickets, and that 30% had actually committed a crime like selling drugs or stealing to pay off their debt. Even more shocking, amongst the people that admitted to committing a crime to pay off their debt, for the vast majority of them, the most serious offense prior to that crime had been a simple traffic infraction. The way things work now, poor people are punished more harshly simply for being poor, and not because they are more dangerous drivers than people who can afford to pay a traffic ticket right away. Suspending licenses and jailing people for unpaid traffic debt and other things unrelated to road safety isn't making Alabama any safer. The punishment does not fit, and this practice is very counterproductive to all the things that we as a state say we are trying to achieve right now, such as prosperity and workforce development. And so that's why Appleseed this year has worked to get a bill, HB 129, passed. This bill is a bill that would end the practice of suspending driver's licenses for things like failure to appear, failure to pay a traffic ticket, and petty drug offenses. Unfortunately, we have run out of time this legislative session to get this bill through. We have been fighting against Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, but we are definitely planning on pursuing this bill again next year. So next slide, please. Another goal of Alabama Appleseed is to increase access to alternatives to incarceration and beyond the prison walls public safety solutions. So just a bit of background about Alabama again. Currently, Alabama's prisons are in crisis. Our history of tough on crime policies have led to us having one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, the highest prison homicide rate in the nation, and a men's prison system that's ridiculously overcrowded. So we are in the process right now being sued by the U.S. Department of Justice as a lawsuit that began and was filed under the Trump administration has argued that our prisons violate the constitutional rights of all the men housed in them. While this won't solve all our problems, Appleseed believes that it's time for the state and agency leaders to seriously invest in alternatives to incarceration, such as pretrial diversion programs. Last year, Alabama Appleseed released an in-depth report entitled In Trouble that studied diversion programs and the user experience when going through them. We found that although diversion programs currently exist throughout the state, they are all user funded. This means that the budget derived to run and operate these programs is derived from the pockets of the people that utilize them. This essentially creates a pay-to-play system in which Jimmy from an affluent home and a family willing to pay $2,000+ gets access to these programs in lieu of incarceration, whereas Joaquin from a less than affluent household and who doesn't have $2,000+ to pay to participate in such a program is shipped off to jail or prison instead. So because of the reliance on user fees, these programs currently contribute to a two-tiered justice system in which defendants like Jimmy and affluent Alabamians have the resources to get access to programs, whereas defendants like Joaquin and low-income Alabamians are sent to jail or prison instead. The fact that the state does not fund or supervise these programs creates a host of other perverse financial incentives and leads to a lack of uniformity and oversight. There are also differences county by county with regard to who has access to these programs and how much they cost. As a solution to this problem, we believe that the state needs to adequately fund existing diversion programs, and the user fees need to be eliminated altogether. That will, in essence, mitigate against wealth-based disparities. If the state is unable, however, to fully fund these programs, other solutions include establishing universal eligibility and completion requirements to safeguard against the existing practice of completion being determined by whether all fees have been paid or not. The state can also create roles and standards that every diversion program is required to abide by in order to make them more uniform throughout the state. And so one such bill that I have been watching and that we are supporting that's designed to create such roles and oversight is making its way through the legislature now. And there is hope that this bill does have time to pass out this session. So that bill number is HB 71. And if passed, it will create an accountability courts commission with the duty to oversee and study all existing diversion programs within the state. Again, this is a bill that Alabama Appleseed is closely watching and supporting. And should this bill not pass this session, we will be there again next session to root for and try to advance this bill. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Akeisha. We really appreciate this information, and it is also shocking to hear the incredibly dire consequences that people can face when they have unpaid court fines and fees. Before we wrap up, I just have a question for our panelists. If people who are listening are interested in doing something or getting involved, I'm wondering if you could share some advice, either in the forms of direct ways to get involved or tactics and strategies that you've used in your work that have been effective in making some changes in this area. Who would like to go first?
I can start. So I would like to lift up again, some recommendations from the report and just some practices that we use at Hope. And that is that we do this work with the community and we do this work with those who are impacted by the systems that we were talking about. And that really we fully believe that those who are impacted should be leading the advocacy and even the decision-making processes around this. And so if you want to get involved, then please make sure that you're reaching out to those who are on the ground in your community and that you're working with them, and more importantly, that you're listening to them as you continue to do your advocacy work. Also, remember to urge your decision makers especially on the state and federal level, to ease debt collections and ease debt collections and stop the accumulation of debt for those who are incarcerated.
I can go ahead and go. So as I said in my little presentation, Sycamore doesn't lobby or advocate, but what we do is try to help people understand everything that's coming into play. And some of the most impactful work that we've done, whether it's on this issue or some other topic, as you mentioned, Sarah, is just showing the sheer volume of a topic and the scope of it that exists. It's not hidden, it's not a secret, but people just aren't aware of it because these things have built up over time. So, what we try to do is just paint that full picture for people so that whatever their perspective is on an issue, they can then have a constructive conversation about it based on the shared set of facts.
Thank you so much. Akeisha?
Yeah, there are several things I think people can do. And so I will start by saying at Alabama Appleseed, we believe in the power of storytelling. And so one really instrumental thing that people can do is that they can start sharing stories about how these issues impact them. So often when it comes to things related to criminal justice or debt, there is a level of shame and people, decide not to talk about these things. But to the extent that we can share that, these are stories that happen all the time to everyday people, it helps to humanize, the issue and helps to get legislators, caring about it in a different way. But from a legislative standpoint, the things I do at the State House, a way that everyday people can get involved and assist is by going to alabamaappleseed.org. So that's www.alabama spelled out, Appleseed, APPLESEED.org, and signing up for our action network. If you sign up to get notifications from us as a result of our action network, we will keep you posted on, when bills are moving, when we need someone to reach out to legislators to ask them to support a bill, to vote in favor of it. And that's a really easy low time commitment, thing that makes a huge difference when it comes to helping these bills advance. And so it's really great when we're able to hear back from legislators that, when I'm calling them, asking them to support a bill, oh yeah, 20 people have already called me, I'm voting yes. So that is a really easy thing to do. And it's something that makes a huge difference. So I definitely recommend that if you're interested in getting engaged with our work, that you do sign up to be a part of our action network.
Sarah, we can't hear you.
I apologize. Thank you so much, Akeisha. I appreciate you lifting up your website, and it's a good reminder for all of us. If you all are interested in learning more about these issues, I encourage you to look up and engage with the organizations here. Of course, Alabama Appleseed is one of them. The Sycamore Institute and the Hope Policy Institute is our sponsor today. My organization is the Southern Center for Human Rights. If you want to take a closer look at the study that was really what the catalyst for today's conversation, go to hopepolicy.org, and there's a link right there on the front page to learn more. And with that, I will thank our wonderful panelists today for sharing their wisdom, expertise, and recommendations. And thank you all for tuning in and listening and learning. Have a great day.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for listening to the presentation. And so now we're going to open up the session for question and answers. So we can check the comment box for any questions that people may have. And then either Mandy, Akeisha, or myself will take it away. And so I did see one question that says, are wages safe from or open to garnishment for collection of the criminal system fees, fines, and debt? And I would say that the short answer is no, that wages can be garnished because of criminal justice debt, and also that a non-payment in criminal justice debt could also result in governmental sanctions as well.
Yeah, so can you all hear me okay? I'm sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. So I know that in Tennessee, certainly any kind of criminal debt can be converted to a civil debt. So just like, you know, you owe a doctor's bill or you owe your rent. So there are the same civil remedies are available to state and local government as are available to kind of any private company or actor. So that means it does open it up to property liens, wage garnishment, all of those remedies. And another interesting practice in Tennessee actually is that there are requirements in the state law that judges do kind of an ability to pay review to make sure that folks are not indigent. But what ends up happening in a lot of places, and this varies by county and it even varies by courtroom within counties, is that many judges will simply waive the criminal penalties that are associated with the debt. So they will say, okay, well, the debt still exists, but it is not a criminal debt anymore. And they will simply convert it to a civil debt. So the debt itself does not actually go away. There are just no longer criminal penalties associated with it, only the civil remedies. So that there's a lot of ways that these show up in civil courts.
Thank you, Mandy. I don't know if there are any, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm checking the chat box now. All right, and we'll just keep looking, and if there are questions, we'll be here to answer. And then as we wait, I guess we'll just ask everyone, we could talk about what are our next steps for each of our organizations. Okay, I'm reading. We're getting things in the chat box, so I'm like reading and also talking at the same time. But Mandy and Akeisha, I think we could talk about what are next steps. What should people be looking forward to advocacy efforts as we continue to move this work forward?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. As far as next steps for the pieces of legislation that I discussed, can you hear me? Okay. For the pieces of legislation that I discussed, we are essentially at the end of our legislative session. And so our last legislative day will be this upcoming Monday. The legislature is on a break right now. But unfortunately, I discussed how Alabama is in a crisis. Our prison system, our state is being sued because of our prison system. But unfortunately, this year, the legislature really did not pass any meaningful criminal justice reform legislation. And so there are rumors that there might be a special session to deal with prison construction or criminal justice reform. And so the next step for us would be preparing for that special session if one were to happen. And if not, we will be preparing for the next legislative session, which will start in January of next year. And so we definitely plan on hitting the ground running, trying to advance the same pieces of legislation that we fought for this year in the next legislative session, whether that's a special session or a regular session. So those are our next steps. So if anybody is interested in these issues, I saw in the chat box that there is at least one audience member from Alabama, and I would love to connect with you. But yeah, that is something that we will be doing, partnering with more people and really pushing these issues again next session.
So we are going to be continuing our research in this area. We have a bunch of different projects planned. The next thing that we'll likely publish in the next couple of weeks is we started to dig into some of the financial data at the county level to better understand how different county governments depend on these fees and fines in terms of funding local services.
and how they relate to other taxes and things like that. And what we're finding there is that place really matters. So, where you get in trouble makes a big difference on in terms of how much is being levied from county to county, and in how much the counties are actually collecting from folks and depending on that to run their local governments. Then we'll begin to get into policy options. So this is a massive space, as you saw, over 360. Each of those is potentially a separate piece of legislation that could go through our General Assembly here. I saw someone asking about bail reform movements. I suspect that that's a topic that we're certainly going to get into is are there alternatives to the bail system and other ways for folks to be released before their trial without placing a financial burden on them? We're also going to be starting with some basics. What would the data infrastructure look like to get a better handle on this issue, on how counties vary in their practices and why they vary? And then we'll be getting into some other things about ability to pay waivers and how broadly those are used and consistently and things like that.
Thanks, Mandy. I also see another question in the chat box that says, is there an opportunity to connect someone to financial counseling services? When should that happen in the criminal justice process? And so my answer to that also leads to me talking about the work that we're doing at Hope as we continue to move forward in looking and exploring financial services and criminal justice related debt, or just the criminal justice system. And so we at Hope believe that financial education, financial counseling should start even before people are re-entering society, even while they are incarcerated. And so we have some partnerships that are coming up within the state of Mississippi, and hopefully that will expand to our other throughout the Deep South region, where we can continue to show up to these correction facilities and really build relationships with those who are incarcerated, and to prepare them for what's to come afterwards, what's to come next, to ensure that they're not falling into some debt traps or cycles with predatory lenders, and that they actually have a healthy relationship with the financial institution. And we could, for those who are interested, we could talk more about what does that look like for Hope, and also what other financial institutions are doing similar work. I see just a couple of more questions. And the next one says, are there efforts at the federal level through future COVID relief bills, if any, or otherwise, in motion to reduce impact on criminal justice fines and fees? I don't know, Mandy, do you have any? No,
yeah,
okay.
I'm not really sure how that would play out, since this is sort of a product of state and local criminal justice systems and statutes. But it's an interesting thought now. I haven't seen anything.
Yeah, and neither have I, but definitely something that I will likely look into. And lastly, we have a question that says, are those charges that are converted to civil debts reported to credit bureaus?
They can be. It just depends on what the local governments want to do. And that's an example of a thing that we certainly don't have a good grasp on in Tennessee, is whether or not that's actually happening.
All right. So I don't see any other questions in the chat box. I'll keep looking as I wrap up. But again, just want to thank our panelists, Akeisha from Alabama Appleseed and Mandy from the Sycamore Institute. Also our moderator, Sarah from the Center for Southern Human Rights, who wasn't able to join our Q&A session today, but has been a really intricate part in making this presentation all come together and flow easily. And also for everyone else in the background who played a major role in making this all happen. And we will share our contact information in the chat box or out after this panel, so that people can stay in touch with the work that we're doing. And also thanks to NCRC, for Maggie and everyone else who has, again, played a major role in this. So again, thank you, everyone.